Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. So we celebrate World Environment Day every year on June 5th. But how many of us really understand the state of the planet we live on? Believe it or not, we humans are just 0.01% of all life, but have already destroyed around 80% of all wild mammals since civilization began. And in today's episode, we will discuss how our population of nearly 8 billion people is having a devastating and disproportionate impact on wildlife everywhere. To help us along from Delhi, we are joined by Bahar Dutt, who's an award-winning environmental journalist and a published author. And in Hong Kong, we have Sam Inglis, who's with ADM Capital Foundation. Thank you both so much for joining us. Bahar, I'm just going to start with you to let you tell us a little bit more about your work and what you do.
Well, Divya, firstly, thank you for having me on the show. I'm an environment journalist. I now turned to teaching journalism. I teach media and climate change. But I've spent most of my life out there reporting from forests, polluted rivers, pieces of land which are being cleared for big mega projects. And I feel like sometimes I've really reported from the front lines of what I think is really like a war on the planet right now.
That may resonate with you, Sam. Tell us more about what ADM Capital is doing in Hong Kong and the work you do in particular with trafficking.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. ADM Capital Foundation works on a whole variety of different environmental projects that really span Asia. But the work that I'm predominantly involved in is really focused on trying to understand what's happening with wildlife in relation to Hong Kong. So that kind of has two broad facets, the legal trade and the illegal trade. And I think the unfortunate thing is Hong Kong is having a really disproportionate impact on both forms of trade. We are a significant trafficker on the world stage, and we also dominate global trade in all manner of wildlife. At least 2,000 species were brought into Hong Kong over the last decade. And that's really indicative of how much wildlife is really, being sought after by people in the city, but also who are looking to exploit the city's legal trade and also all of the things that make us great for a legal business make us great for illegal business. And so we're seeing, this profusion of trade that's coming through the city in all manner of biodiversity. And so we're just trying to understand what that looks like, what it comprises, and try to get a handle on how that's impacting the biodiversity around the planet.
Yeah, and the interesting thing about that, Sam, is that Hong Kong is a small, very urban city, and yet so much of the focus of the wildlife trade. But Bahar, India, on the other hand, is home to 91,000 animal species, which represents about 6.5% of the world's fauna. But yet after Brazil, it has one of the fastest rates of deforestation. Like, why are conservation efforts failing, and what challenges are they facing?
So, Divya, you've said it correctly. I think sometimes before I get to the bad stuff, let's talk about the good stuff, which is that let's celebrate what we have. We are a mega diverse country. We have all kinds of ecosystems, from a cold desert to a hot desert to islands to the Himalayas. And we have 70% of the world's tiger population. Parts of Asia, the tigers have completely been wiped out. India is still holding on to its tigers. But all this biodiversity really exists in a sea of humanity. And, I found it interesting that when you were making the introduction to the show, you talked about population. But I would say population is not the problem. The problem is consumption levels. The consumption, say, of high consumption levels of what's going on in the more industrialized or developed countries. So I think that's what needs to be looked at. Coming back to India, what are our challenges? We're a globalizing economy. 50% of India's infrastructure is yet to be built. And this is now in direct conflict with our ecology. So you have rivers which are being excavated for sand, which goes into construction. You have forests which are being cleared for mining projects, which is again going to fuel our growth. So at some point, the two are, as I said in the beginning, are at war with each other. The ecology and this huge infrastructure development which India is going to go through. And I think the challenge is going to be, how do we protect our biodiversity with these mega infrastructure, big projects, this trillion-dollar economy that we are headed towards. And as a journalist, I've been trying to report on the tensions between the two. And you find that basically, environment laws, we have some of the best environment laws in the country. India, we have a national green tribunal, which is a green judiciary. And yet, in spite of all these protective measures in place, we are losing our biodiversity. So as I said, the economists and the ecologists need to figure out how they're going to work together to protect what we have.
Right, so you talk about laws. Let's talk about treaties and government efforts, Sam. And Hong Kong is signatory to CITES, which is a framework that where governments are supposed to be able to stop or get a handle on trafficking. Can you explain why that doesn't seem to be helping matters on the ground?
Yeah, so the convention is called the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species of Fauna and Flora, and CITES, as it is better known, has been in effect since 1975. And it's, it's the best we have, and I think that that's a really important point to make at the outset. Any international mechanism that's trying to account for the multiplicity of national regulations and situations of countries that are providing wildlife, that are conserving wildlife, that are acting as conveyors to other jurisdictions and are consuming wildlife. All of those things have to be somehow accounted for under the trade mechanism that is CITES. So that's an inherently complicated and challenging thing for one mechanism to try and get a handle on. But as you say, there are a variety of things that could be done better. And I suppose one of the challenges that we see, particularly in the context of Hong Kong, is that there are some interesting categorizations which allow for species which, potentially are being impacted by trade to be traded in volumes that would raise some flags for conservationists. So there is a species, the yellow-spotted river turtle, for example, that comes from Peru, and that's traded under a code that says ranched. Now, ranched animals are those animals which are taken from the wild as juveniles or eggs, and ostensibly the programs that they go into are for conservation purposes which feed back into the natural ecosystems which those animals were taken out of. But it also allows for commercial trade in those species. And so once you have this kind of mixing of capitalism and conservation, there's inherently going to be some conflicts and challenges that you see coming up. And the reason it's relevant to Hong Kong is because we are the world's largest importer of this single turtle species, importing millions over the last decade. And that's, we have to weigh up, is it worth putting these species under pressure, no matter what the best intent is when it comes to the conservation? We need to really be very cognizant of whether those programs are helping or hindering, whether they're spurring demand, and whether they are, whether there is accountability in the system, and also whether we know what the outcomes and fates of these animals are. Because speaking again from the Hong Kong experience, we know that once an animal leaves a pet shop here, we actually lose all oversight. Unless it's involved in a crime or a cruelty incident, we actually don't see that animal pop up on the radar again. And so that's a major concern when you consider that Hong Kong, under CITES, is the world's largest importer of live reptiles, with about 4 and a bit million coming in over the last 7 years. So we have an enormous footprint. We have an enormously important role in this trade. And the fact that there is a part in this system where the animals just disappear certainly raises some concerns.
Well, I'm just curious, Sam, that I found that when it comes to wildlife trade, there is a lot of focus on individual animals. But would you say that I think that the wildlife, the people who are trying to control wildlife trade perhaps need to work better with the managers of, say, protected areas? Or how do we protect our habitats better such that these animals are never traded in the first place? And do you think that's sort of a lacunae in conservation policy, that we've somehow the enforcement agencies haven't learned to work together, perhaps with the managers and the scientists?
Well, I think your point about, greater communication between all of the different stakeholders is vital. That is the heart of the problem. Communication in so many instances is the one thing that is letting us down, whether it's understanding what the composition of the trade is, what the conservation concerns might be, and how conservationists and shop owners might potentially work together. I think there's definitely avenues for that dialogue to be engaged in. In terms of Hong Kong's footprint, I think the challenges that we have here are that they don't tend to see the impact of the trade. And I think that's fundamentally a big challenge for a place that is a really big demand center. Hong Kong and broader China, one of the challenges that we have is people don't necessarily know what's on their shelves. They don't know what's on the streets. They don't know what they're looking at. And they can't therefore comprehend or advocate or try to get a handle on the impact that trade is happening in those biodiverse, rich home ranges.
Yeah, the reason why I asked, Divya, if I may jump in again, is, the experience from India, Northeast India, and perhaps, Sam, you would have traced this as well. We have found routes from, wildlife being traded out from channels from Northeast India into Southeast Asia, eventually making it perhaps to markets in Hong Kong, in China. So the struggle that I faced while reporting from parts of, say, Northeast India is that I think our habitats are not adequately protected. Habitats are being opened up, again, for road and construction projects, which makes accessibility easier. So, poachers who otherwise could not go into the forest and you would perhaps hunt for the pot are now, hunting for traders. And that's what then goes into the wildlife trade routes and the markets eventually.
Absolutely. And actually, I think an interesting sort of converse situation arose in COVID. As you say, expanding infrastructure into these remote regions is absolutely putting entire ecosystems under pressure. It makes these animals more accessible to people who want to exploit them, and therefore regulation has to try and keep up with that diversified risk landscape. So absolutely, that is 100% an issue. Conversely, what we saw was when the world was in lockdown, we actually saw certain species being put under pressure by the growth in local demand. So as these trafficking syndicates could not get their products out of places like, say, Malaysia or Indonesia, they started to cultivate domestic markets which hadn't historically been as present or problematic or hungry for these types of products. So, there is an incredibly complicated trade out there. It's evolving all the time. And I think that the main challenge or one of the main challenges is absolutely that regulations aren't keeping up. Conservationists are working hard to try and keep track of what's going on, but it's incredibly challenging for sure.
Right, I want to continue this conversation on trafficking, and basically it brings together so many different issues, particularly when it comes to endangered species. And I also want to talk about the type of species in particular that are most at risk. But before that, let's talk about biodiversity and how it's shrinking around the world. And this all, again, relates to the idea of trafficking, poaching, and human or animals' habitat slowly shrinking also. The World Wildlife Fund's 2022 Living Planet report found an average decline of 69% of species in populations since 1970. In fact, research suggests that 96%, that's 96% of all mammals on Earth are humans and livestock, with wild mammals only constituting around 4%. So here in Taiwan, amphibians are the most threatened species, accounting for almost 30% of the total tally. Fish, mammals, birds, and reptiles are also at risk. We can now hear from Meiyu Liu, who has worked for Taiwan's Forestry Bureau and is calling for more action and support for conservation.
Taiwan is isn't doing enough for wildlife conservation. The Forestry Bureau didn't have enough fund, and there are a lot of people, they're still thinking like animals are just dogs and cats, but actually they're domesticated animals, they're not wildlife. And and also dogs and cats are actually competing habitats with our wildlife. It's still a long way to go to educate the general public.
So she brings together a lot of issues there in that soundbite. I want to start with you, Sam, and she talks about how most people are not aware. And I think one of the things your foundation looks at is the issue of what you call invisible pets. And your report talks about how many of these animals, or some of these animals that do pass through Hong Kong, aren't even scientifically named or researched or studied yet. And yet you find them in the markets of Hong Kong. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's come to our attention that there are, boutique poachers who do, I think from Germany or the Czech Republic, there are instances where, a species that has literally just been found, completely new to science, just been named in the academic literature. Somebody finds out the exact spot by looking up a website where biologists, well-intentioned, have advertised where they've found this unique and amazing new species. And you have these boutique poachers who hop on a flight the very next day and spend the next month hiring local porters, trekking into remote wildernesses, and, in some instances, actually poaching the entire population, the entire global population of an entire species before, the second scientist has even made it there to try and understand what the population looks like and try to understand more about the species. So absolutely that is happening, and that's a tremendously concerning behavior and trend. But I think in Hong Kong, in terms of the invisibility of pets, that's been a long-standing issue here. The last time that there was a survey by the government that included an analysis of pets that were not domesticated cats and dogs was about 2005. So we are well beyond that. The trade has ballooned out of all recognition of the scale of the trade at that point in time. And as I mentioned, we have thousands of species that are in trade here. We know that from 2015 to 2021, there was at least 700 species of live exotic pets. So that's mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, or arthropods, which were being imported ostensibly for the commercial pet trade in Hong Kong. And as I said before, the challenge that we have is once the owner has walked out of that shop with the animal in hand, the animal disappears from our records. We do not know whether the animal remains in Hong Kong, which would imply that there are potentially 2 reptiles to every household in Hong Kong. We don't know if they are being dying in droves. We don't know if they are being eaten or cooked into medicines. And even more importantly, we do not know if they are leaving the city through illegal means, because we know that there is a huge illicit trafficking network or series of networks that are facilitating the illegal trade out of and into the city. And inevitably, the exotic pet trade is feeding into that. But we just don't have a good handle on exactly what that looks like. And that raises a huge number of concerns about the welfare, the conservation value, and a whole variety of other factors, as well as the potential financial gains for these criminal organizations who are involved in this illicit trade.
And Bahar, can you speak about that from the Indian perspective? Very different situation to Hong Kong, as India is so big and you're seeing poaching and trafficking from even state to state. Can you tell us what the picture in India is?
I think the bigger problem is fragmentation of our habitats. And that again, I think ties back to the development pathways that the country is pursuing. And, I wrote about this in my book called Rewilding in India, which I think generates hope. It's a new concept, which is a restoration of habitats and ecosystems. Or, if we have a national park where tigers have disappeared, can we say move them from Rajasthan or other national parks where they're in abundance and put them into that national park where they were wiped out due to poaching? So it's happened, in Rajasthan and Sariska, and then from central India, they were moved to central India to Panna, which lost all its tigers to poaching. They're doing well. They've multiplied. The tigers have had cubs. So rewilding in that sense worked. But as I say in my book, rewilding is a far more complicated story. In India, there are multiple stakeholders when it comes to our forests. We have to think of communities. And I think we still haven't learned how to work with communities. We continue to see them as threats to conservation. And I think in the future, if we can learn to tap into that indigenous knowledge not in some, romantic way, but in real terms, sitting down, working with communities and involving them in the protection of forests, then a lot of, what Sam is talking about in terms of poaching and removal of animals into the trade business, that may not happen. People don't feel invested in conservation. They don't feel as if they have a stake in conservation. And then, therefore, the only option then left is, why not trade the animal? So I think that dichotomy must be resolved if we have to move forward and protect this, this tremendous, not just resource, but sheer richness of life that we have around us.
Speaking of rewilding, and I want to use your phrase for this, let me give you an example of what's happening here in Taiwan, and perhaps, as you said, that can give some hope to others. There's been a significant progress in pangolin conservation. The pangolin is the most widely trafficked mammal in the world, but here, as you can see here, the Formosan pangolins have been protected by the law and helped along by public awareness for decades. So now there is a stable population in the wild. This vision you're looking at is from the Pangolin Rescue Program at Taipei Zoo that started in 1997. Sam, why are pangolins the most trafficked mammals in the world?
Well, they're mainly sought after for mainly two purposes: their scales and their carcasses. So the scales, in particular, are sought after for use in traditional Chinese medicines or other traditional medicines. But we see them mostly arriving in Hong Kong in purely sort of dried shell form, in dried scale form. But the other purpose is for their carcasses. So a lot of the time, particularly in home range states, because carcasses, of course, will rot if they are in long-term transit, they will be consumed sometimes by local communities, sometimes they will be transported. So in Hong Kong, we have seen frozen carcasses arriving in the city. There have been particularly catastrophic seizures in places like Malaysia, with thousands upon thousands of carcasses found in containers. And unfortunately, due to health concerns and the state of the carcasses, they had no recourse but to burn them. But those are the main driving forces for bringing those in, and they're used in treating all forms of maladies. And there are unfortunately still legal pathways for acquiring pangolin scales, and they have up until recently at least been doled out by hospitals in mainland China. So it's quite concerning that practice still persists.
The smaller species, I feel, Divya, never get attention. I'm so glad you showed, that footage of the pangolin, but amphibians, and you're seeing tortoises and turtles. We keep hearing about India in the context of tigers, but our smaller species, or gibbons, for instance, again found in northeast India, and it's India's only 8 species. You find it in markets in Thailand. I think that this World Environment Day, if I were to make a pitch, I would make a pitch for the lesser fauna, the less charismatic species. They end up in trade as well in large volumes. And I think that, again, from the point of view of conservation interventions, we need to turn our attention to these smaller species. And Divya, if I can also touch upon this, in the context of this obsession with charismatic megafauna, we have the cheetah project, which, everybody's heard about, that India got, 20 African cheetahs, and they were released into central India into a forest, a grassland, actually. It's a protected area. But there have been problems with that project, just in terms of the sheer, vastness of land that the cheetahs need. What we found is 2 of the cheetahs died. One of them gave birth to cubs. So that was good news. But it's a project which has been, under a lot of scrutiny because people argued that, yes, we used to have cheetahs in India, but if we had to bring them back, why not have the Asiatic cheetah, which is still found in Iran, for instance? At least genetically, it would have been closer. We never had African cheetahs in India. These projects, it was inaugurated by our Prime Minister, so it got a lot of attention. There's a lot of money that has gone into these projects. I've heard scientists saying that why could we not use that money, say, for instance, to conserve the great Indian bustard, which is this critically endangered bird which is found in the same habitat, which almost ended up being India's national bird. Eventually, it was the peacock because they felt that the bustard didn't have phonetically a very pleasing name. But, just because of that, but if you look at the bird, it's a majestic, handsome bird, and that should have been protected as opposed to bringing in 20 African cheetahs. So I think this obsession with charismatic megafauna has to change.
And before we go, a stark reminder of why we need to act now. The United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity has found that we lose up to 150 species every single day. And that is why the work of our guests, Bahar Dutt in Delhi and Sam Inglis in Hong Kong, are so important. Thank you both for being on the show, and thank you for your conservation efforts. And to our viewers, thank you for your company. Stay connected.